Hello, everyone. Thank you for your patience and thank you for being here with us today. Good morning, evening, and afternoon, since we are receiving participants from different parts of the world. I give you all a hard welcome into the webinars. This is a follow-up series of activities of the trainings we had last year in different regions, and also the first series of webinars we hosted more than 1 year ago. These are part of the Responsible Business Conduct Food Agreement from the Netherlands, where different organizations present here and co-facilitating are behind also here with me from CNV, Global March Against Child Labor, Wortendaad, and Cordate. So welcome, everyone. So today we start with the legislation and regulation of the European Union, as well as the roles of different local stakeholders and local experts. So basically, all of you. So as you can see in the screen, we have these two main points: inform on the latest developments on the content of European and Dutch due diligence legislation, and discuss the role as experts or facilitators, basically you, when European Dutch companies approach you for assistance under these new laws. So in order to provide this training, we have with us an expert that has been also very active participant and important stakeholder within the Dutch agreements. We have with us Manon Wolfkamp. She is a business and human rights expert and has been busy in this sector for more than 11 years, since 2011. She has been training CSOs in different topics such as political affairs as well as legislation, and she has supported as well several companies, including small, medium enterprises, in how to do their due diligence process, so how they can start complying in these 6 steps that we all know, but we're going to start with a little bit of recap into these steps. So without further ado, thank you, Manon, for being here, and please be engaged in this webinar.
Thank you, Angela, for this introduction, and welcome. Welcome to you all. Very happy you're here. So for today, we'll be discussing legislation, but we will first start with a small recap of what is actually behind this legislation, due diligence and the OECD guidelines and the UNGPs. And then we will also discuss together the role that you as local experts can play in supporting companies in doing their due diligence. And we'll do that in small breakout group. We'll do that later on. And then at the end, of course, we will share with you what other webinars they have organized and that you can attend as local experts. So for a small recap, you've all attended the webinar that was already organized on the theory of human rights due diligence. But I thought it would be good to start very briefly with 2 different concepts: responsible business conduct and corporate social responsibility. In different contexts, these 2 concepts have different meaning. Usually, when we talk about corporate social responsibility, people refer to more charity-like activities, like sponsoring schools or sponsoring a local hockey team or soccer team, or providing with student scholarships for students from the local community. This is all great. This is great work of companies, and they really contribute to society by doing these kind of efforts. So CSR is a great way for companies to show their involvement with communities and local society. But what we will be discussing today is responsible business conduct. Responsible business conduct is really about business operations and how business operates in value chains, how they respect human rights, how they respect the environment, how they respect climate. So this is really about business practices like purchasing practices, or how they develop complaints mechanisms. It's really about their own procedures. And this is a really crucial difference when you discuss this with companies. And so this legislation and human rights due diligence is really about their own operations. They need to look inside themselves, and need to adjust their own procedures. And then, of course, we invite them to keep on donating all kinds of nice projects to charity, which is great. So how can companies do this responsible business conduct? This has been decided by the UN in 2011 when the United Nations Guiding Principle on Business and Human Rights were adopted, the UNGPs. So the UNGPs are built on a framework of 3 pillars. They have the state duty to protect human rights, the business responsibility to respect human rights, and remedy. So the second pillar, the business respect for human rights, is what's really central in this webinar, together with part of the 3rd pillar, remedy. this respect for business for human rights is changing into a duty for business to respect human rights because of all the legislative discussions going on. In 2011 already, the UNGP framework was adopted by the OECD when they revised their guidelines. So the OECD is this country of, I always say the rich country clubs, but so rich countries that have decided to develop guidelines on how their multinationals should behave in supply chains. And these guidelines were incorporated the elements of the UNGPs on responsible business conduct. And then were also extended to environment. So not just human rights, but also the environment. Then they developed a very good guidance in 2018. I would strongly advise you to read that guidance. The OECD guidance, due diligence guidance for responsible business conduct. And then they also developed special guidance for the agricultural value chains. This is a little bit harder to read, but still very informative for agriculture. So human rights and environmental due diligence, what does it entail? So first of all, it's a process. It's a continuous process that companies or enterprises should carry out. They should identify, mitigate, and address potential or actual human rights or environmental impacts in their own operations, in their supply chains, and with other business relations. And these other business relations are often value chain. It's really a continuous process, and it's really about risks to others outside of the company. It was really new and quite fundamental change in how we looked at responsible business conduct in 2011. Because before, you will maybe responsible for the first tier, but that's it. And now we're saying it's the entire value chain. It's not just the first tier, it's also subcontractors, and the subcontractors of the subcontractors is really, really deep down into the value chain. It's also risk-based, so it means it focuses on how a company can contribute or cause possible negative impacts. It also focuses on effectiveness. What works? You need to monitor what you're doing, and you need to change and revise what you're doing. You need to involve relevant stakeholders in every stage of the due diligence process. And lastly, if necessary, you need to make sure you provide for remedy. So this all is part of due diligence and is different from what was traditionally seen as compliance. This is the way the 6 steps are usually presented to business. These are the 6 steps of the due diligence process. Step 1, develop your own policy and make sure this policy is embedded in all of your policies and procedures. Right? It's not just about writing this policy and then forgetting about it in a drawer, but really making sure that everybody within the company understands their role and what they need to do. That's step 1. Step 2 is you need to identify your entire value chain and all of the possible potential adverse impacts on human rights, environment, and climate. Then you need to see how can I prevent or mitigate or stop these potential negative impacts from actually happening. You need to devise an action plan for that. Step 4, you need to monitor, am I taking the right measures? Is it working well? Step 5, you need to communicate, be transparent of what you're doing, what you have prioritized, if it worked or not, if you provided remedy, what kind of impacts did you identify. And then step 6, if there was actually a negative impact in your value chain and you were causing it or you were contributing to it, you need to provide for remedy. That's step 6. So these 6 steps, really the ongoing process of due diligence. Key aspects, internationally recognized RBC standards. This is really not invented by Europe or the US, this is international. This is really a UN body that was then adopted by the OECD. It works preventively, so the whole process is first of all trying to ensure that negative impacts do not happen. If they do happen, we have remedy. Then it's a dynamic process, it's ongoing, it's flexible and reflective. So whatever you find out, for example, in step 4, when you monitor your whole process, might feed back into your policies. Maybe you need to adjust your policies and procedures because of the results of your monitoring. So it all interconnects. Then it's risk-oriented, we already discussed that. And also make sure that business really pays additional or extra attention to vulnerable groups and to gender. For example, children, or people who live with a handicap, they're often overlooked. And you need to really devote extra attention to them and to the consequences to them of your business, of business actions. then the whole concept is proportional. That means that medium and small enterprises, they still have the responsibility, they still need to do due diligence, but then they have a lesser responsibility than multinational enterprises who often have much more negative impacts. Then you need to make sure you involve stakeholders in every one of the 6 steps, in every single one of the 6 steps. And I think lastly, and maybe this is the most important one, is that there's a shared responsibility in the entire value chain. It's really crucial that each and every stakeholder in the value chain, every business partner in the value chain takes its responsibility in making sure that negative impacts do not occur, or that when they do occur, they are remediated. Right? This is a process that cannot be done by one actor in the value chain. It's really a joint responsibility. So these are some of the key elements of due diligence. And why is this important? Because all of the legislation that's coming up is somehow based on this framework, on these norms and on the concept of due diligence. Some a little bit more, some a little bit less. But in principle, if business implements the OECD guidelines, they will comply with all of the legislation developed right now in Europe. So it's quite important to understand this concept and the OECD guidelines in order to be able to support business in complying with the legislation upcoming. So as you can see on this image, legislation is really coming up in Europe. Of course, the OECD guidelines and the UNGPs are voluntary. It's what we call soft norms. And what we discovered in the past years is that although many companies say they like these soft norms and say this is the way to do it, there are not so many that actually implement the OECD guidelines or the UNGPs. A very small minority of companies is actually working on it. And in order to really create this impact and to make sure that business can really contribute in a very positive way to all of these big developmental issues, we need to make sure that more business starts implementing the OECD guidelines and the UNGPs. Which is why, especially in Europe, but also, for example, in Australia and in the US, civil society is really asking for legislation, together with a whole set of progressive business that is actually doing due diligence. So in France, in Germany, and in Norway, broad due diligence legislation has already been adopted and is already being implemented. So companies in those 3 countries already need to comply with this legislation. And then in Spain, in the Benelux, so that's Luxembourg, Belgium, and in the Netherlands, there's also a national legislative proposal. But maybe most importantly, within the EU, there are several legislative proposals that have a touch of due diligence. First of all, there's the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, or the CSDDD. Then there's the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, the CSRD. Then there is Deforestation Regulation and the Forced Labor Regulation. There are more, but they don't really apply to the agricultural sector. So these 4, I think, are most important for our discussions right now. And I will discuss each and every one of them. We start with the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, since this was actually the first directive that was developed within the EU. This is a reporting requirement for companies. They need to report on what they are doing. All companies, 250 employees or more. They need to report on their business model and their strategy, including on their plans for zero net targets, for emissions, for how it impact of sustainability risks and opportunities, how the strategy plans reflect the interests of stakeholders, sustain the goals and their progress, on their due diligence process, on potential negative impacts throughout the value chain or supply chain they have found, on the role of management, and on the company's main sustainability risks. It's quite a heavy body of reporting they need to do. And at this moment, indicators are being developed in Europe, which companies need to fill out. This is really a lot of work for them, and it's really a mind shift also. What is really new is that accountants need to verify what companies are reporting. Also, they will need to be reporting on double materiality, meaning that they need to report on how the outside world affects them and their financial goals, but also how they actually affect the outside world. Right? So what do their business operations actually, what kind of consequence do they have for stakeholders, local communities, workers in factories or at plantations? And then lastly, it will go into force from next year. And the first companies need to report on next year, so on 2024. So it's coming up. Second, the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, the CSDDD. This is really a due diligence requirement for companies that that sell goods or services on the European market. So it also applies to companies outside of the European Union that want to sell on the European market. There are 3 proposals, and I've decided to discuss 2 with you because we're still not sure really what it's going to be, what the final result will be. The Commission proposed a directive. The European Council reflected and developed their own proposal. That's the heads of states. And then, or the ministers of economic affairs, I need to be correct. And then the parliament also developed its own proposal or reflection on the Commission proposal. And today I decided to discuss with you the original Commission proposal and the parliamentary proposal, because I think the Commission proposal is the least ambitious and the parliamentary proposal is most ambitious. So we probably end up with something in between. All right? There is a vote tomorrow on the parliamentary position. It's a really tight vote, so it's a really exciting time actually right now for us here in Europe. So tomorrow we know more about the final European Parliament position, and after they've reached the decision, the trilogue will start. So the Council, the Commission and the Parliament together will negotiate and discuss what the final directive will look like, and we will probably know end of this year, beginning of next year. So maybe January 2024, we'll know what the European directive will actually look like. So what are they aiming for? Well, first of all, European Commission says it applies to companies larger than 500 or in certain risk sectors if you're larger than 250. And agriculture is a risk sector. The European Parliament says 250 employees, doesn't matter in which sector you operate, but only from 2029. So they have a staggered implementation. They start with 1,000 employees, then 500, and then 250 in 2029. And then what do they need to do? Well, what they need to do is kind of the same in all of the proposals. So they need to integrate due diligence in their policies. They need to identify actual and potential adverse impacts. They need to prevent, mitigate, and stop these potential or actual impacts. They need to establish a grievance mechanism. They need to monitor. They need to communicate. So basically, 6 steps of due diligence. The way it's formulated so the devil is really in the details, right? It really matters how it's formulated or on how effective it is. For example, in the Commission proposal, there's an over-reliance on audits and contractual clauses, meaning, as a European retailer, you can sign a contract saying to your supplier, we don't want child labor in our supply chain. Please sign that you don't have child labor in your supply chain. Then the supplier goes to their supplier saying, I've got this contract stating I don't have child labor in my supply chain. Please sign that you don't have child labor in your supply chain. And then the contract moves another step in the supply chain. We call this contractual cascading. Another problem, of course, is audits, very much of an over-reliance on audits. So in the parliamentary proposal, there's a less of a reliance on audits and on contractual clauses, which is good, we feel, because due diligence needs to be a shared responsibility. So in the parliamentary proposal, it's stated explicitly that companies should look at their own purchasing practices, which is really vital and very key. Then the Commission proposal, the due diligence is limited to the established business relationship, which kind of means the first tier. So it's really those supply chain partners that you have a established business relationship with, which is usually only your first tier. So this is a big limitation. And actually, if this would really happen, it would be a little bit of pointless, because usually these negative impacts don't happen in the first tier of the supply chain, but further along down the supply chain. So the European parliamentary proposal says you need to apply this to your entire value chain except for use. So companies cannot be held accountable for the use by consumers of their products. It's also a big difference. And then the Commission proposal says stakeholder consultation only when relevant. And then the parliamentary proposal says stakeholder consultation every step, always relevant in every step of due diligence. So these are some of the elements which are different in the 2 proposals. Another one, which I think is quite vital, is that in the parliamentary proposal, there's a real, there's a separate article on remedy. You need to provide remedy, which is different from the Commission proposal, but it doesn't even mention the word remedy. So I think that's also a big plus for the parliamentary proposal. Where we will end up, we don't know. It's really, well, we are working very hard to try to get it aligned as much as possible with the OECD guidelines, but it's a tough fight. Then we go to 2 risk-based laws. The first one is a deforestation regulation. So this is really only about deforestation. And this is only for importers. So this applies for importers of palm oil, beef, soy, coffee, cocoa, and timber, and all products related from it. Sorry, I need to talk slower. I will do that. Importers need to collect information showing that the product was not produced on land deforested after December 31st, or that forest degeneration occurred after that date. That's first. How do you do this? Well, you do a risk analysis and you take risk mitigating measures. Like, for example, using satellite tracking systems or taking isotopic testing of the product that's being imported so they can trace the origins back to where it actually came from on GPS location level. Really intense legislation, which will have a lot of impact, we feel, on companies. There will also be supporting measures for producing countries to make sure that they can actually support companies on how to do this. It's already adopted by all of the EU institutions, so this is in place. It cannot be changed. It now needs to be transposed into national law, but we don't know when yet. It's still up in the air. The date still needs to be set, but if the Commission says on July 1st, this will enter into force, 6 months after that, the member states need to make sure that they have everything ready and the regulation applies. Then finally, for Europe, the forced labor regulation. This is an enforcement mechanism. So this is really for EU supervisory bodies and enforcement mechanisms. It gives customs and other supervisors the authority to actually take products off the European market if they think or if they can prove it's been made with forced labor. So first of all, the supervisor does a broad scoping, like what are areas in the world where forced labor really happens, or what are types of products where it's prevalent. This is a kind of first scoping exercise. Civil society can also submit. It can submit reports or can submit complaints. Then second, there will be a detailed investigation of certain companies or certain products. And then third, if the supervisor can prove forced labor has been used in the production of these goods and services, they can take the product off the market. It covers the entire supply chain, it covers in and export, it covers domestic and foreign companies. But it's still a proposal from the Commission. It's not been debated by Parliament, it's not been debated by Council, so we have no idea when this will come into force or what will happen. It's less, we feel it's less strong than the American forced labor regulation. It does not provide, for example, for any remedy or for any obligation to actually make things right, to actually make sure that the forced labor situation is solved in the supply chain. But maybe that will change in the coming years when the regulation is debated. So these are 4 EU, very important, crucial EU laws coming up for the agricultural sector. Then we go to the Netherlands, finally. In the Netherlands, we have a parliamentary proposal. It's broad due diligence legislation, and it's very much aligned and based on the OECD guidelines. So the steps here that you see are very much, I can repeat them, but I will just be repeating the due diligence requirements that the OECD lays out, so I won't do that. But it will apply to all companies selling goods or services on the Dutch market, so also for companies who are non-Dutch. And every company with 250 or more employees. So it's quite ambitious in its scope. There's also a general duty of care which applies to all companies. So all companies need to make sure that there are no negative impacts in their value chains. But only if you have 250 or more employees, you need to do due diligence. You need to involve stakeholders in every step. And there's public, criminal and civil enforcement. And this is also quite ambitious. The parliamentary process has started, so we're not sure yet when it will actually, when the law will actually pass, and if the law will actually pass. There's a big debate going on in the Netherlands right now, but it's very much aligned with the OECD guidelines. So for companies, if they implement the OECD guidelines, they fulfill the criteria of the Dutch law, but also of the EU proposal, whether it will be the Commission proposal or the parliamentary proposal. They comply with the German law, they comply with the French law, they comply with the Norwegian law. So if a company comes to you and says, oh, it's so much, there's so many laws, what do we do? You'd say, start implementing the OECD guidelines. That's really the best advice you can give any company you work with. That's it on legislation. Any questions?
Yeah, very interesting, everything you've been saying. I just have the doubt on how to implement the prevention in the due diligence, because most of the cases that get into to try to solve is because it already happened, and I haven't heard much about prevention. Thank you.
No, that's a very good question. And of course, that's very true. So what we often hear is when the actual impacts have already happened. But the whole due diligence system in itself is meant to be preventive. So if a company starts talking about human rights and is discussing this with their suppliers and is adjusting its purchasing practices, for example. So if, for example, in textile, there's always a big problem with the textile brands changing their orders. So they say, I want 500 yellow T-shirts. And then they call up a week later and say, oh, by the way, yellow, that's not the color in fashion anymore. We want red. But we don't change the date when you need to deliver the T-shirts to us. So then the factory owner is almost forced to let his people work double shifts, and he doesn't get extra paid, nor does he get a relief in delivery date. So he's almost forced to let his people work too hard for too little money. So this is a purchasing practice that needs to change with this European brand. Same goes for living wage, for example. If European retailers are paying not enough money for bananas, for example, then they need to start paying more so that their supplier can actually pay decent wages to people working at plantations. So in that way, it's meant preventative. So to really also look at what they're doing to make it possible that these negative impacts happen. But I agree with you, there's still a very long way to go, and it's not very easy. But this is what the main goal would be of human rights due diligence. And fortunately, there's also remedies so that if these actual impacts actually happen, we have remedy to remediate people.
Thanks.
David, you had a question as well?
Yes, thank you for the presentation. I came a second time. For the first slot, I had very bad internet, so I missed out some of the points, and I waited a bit longer to attend the second session. So thank you so much. I represent the umbrella body of flower exporters in Uganda. And from what I've seen, whatever you have presented, we are going to be required to incorporate due diligence in all our procedures. We export flowers mainly to mainland Europe, and most of the flowers actually reach the Netherlands. And it takes me back to the very last part of the presentation. Now, our farms, we have those that are owned by Dutch, and we also have those that are owned by locals. So in terms of this legislation, because we are going to run like compliance support programs with the farms, and this is something I certainly think we shall need to start to educate the farms about. So in terms of the legislation, how does it affect us, considering that some are Dutch-owned farms, although they are located in Uganda, and some are locally owned, but they all have their products ending up in the Netherlands. Just provide me guidance on that.
That's a good question. I think. Thank you for that, and thanks for rejoining. Sorry that the connection wasn't good enough for the first session. In principle, it doesn't matter if it's a Dutch company or a Ugandan company. When they export their flowers to the Netherlands, they need to adhere to the same legislation. Of course, in reality, it's probably easier for a Dutch supervisor to actually enforce the legislation with the Dutch company. I think we need to be realistic. But then the Dutch supervisor will then, somebody's importing these flowers, probably a Dutch trader, So then the Dutch trader will be asked to do the due diligence, and they will check in their supply chain, and they will then talk to the Ugandan farm owners, like, what are you doing, and how can you show us how you did your due diligence, and how can we support you in doing your due diligence? That would be the way it would probably be enforced. But in principle, the law applies to also the plantations owned by the Dutch companies and to the plantations owned by the Ugandan companies. Does that answer your question? And great, by the way, that you're starting to educate and to support these farms.
Yes, yeah. It's something that we have on our the annual program for the supporting the farms. Yeah.
What is the reaction of the farms on the education?
You see, farms are majorly compliance. We have to comply in order to be able to sell. So anything that creeps into affects the compliance program, they will react to it. Yeah, because if it's the law and we are required to abide by that, then they will do what? They will abide. They will abide. Yeah, because I mean, we have all these certification programs with a lot of these welfare issues, concern about the environment, and they keep on amending them. For example, we all have this MPS certification. MPS, I think, is from the Dutch, from Netherlands, and there's so many requirements. They keep on updating these requirements. And we've seen over time that some of these changes in compliance requirements keep coming in through the certification program. So farms, because it affects the sales of the farms, then they respond. So I don't think it will be any different from this due diligence.
Right, that's good to hear. Thank you. Thanks, David. So then we move to the next part of our exercise, yeah? And so what we now would like to do, because as local experts, you can play a really important role in supporting Dutch, European, but also local companies in actually complying with this legislation, and actually doing due diligence. What we now wanted to do is wanted to split you up in two groups. Two groups. We want to split you up in two groups, two breakout groups. And we'd like to ask you together to brainstorm a little bit on what kind of role, what kind of services, how can you actually facilitate, support local Dutch companies in doing their due diligence? What kind of role could you play? And then keep these 6 steps of due diligence in mind. Yes, welcome back. I hope you had fruitful discussions in your breakout groups. And I will, without further ado, actually ask the presenter of Group 1. I'm not sure who that is. Marco, are you?
No, Mulenga.
Mulenga? I hope I pronounced your name right, but I understood you would present the results of Group 1. I have opened your whiteboard. I think everybody can now see the whiteboard of Group 1. And please, go ahead.
So I think, as you can see on the whiteboard, we had a fruitful discussion. And some of the things that came up were things like conducting due diligence. Okay.
I'm trying, huh? Okay, better?
Yeah.
Oh, it's moving out of the screen. Okay, I think this is it.
Okay, so I think we discussed that it is important that we help, as local experts, we help companies in conducting due diligence, walk them through the process and all that. We also discussed that it would be important for us to help companies with regards to the importance of conducting human rights due diligence in entering the European market. Then there was also a discussion on providing insights into local context and stakeholders to these companies that are either coming in or already established in our localities with regards to the issues of human rights due diligence. We also talked about the issue of continuous research on potential risks. I think it is also important with the fact that the process itself of conducting due diligence it's not a one-off process. So I think it is important that there's continuous research with regards to potential risks to companies. Systemized good practices with regards due diligence was also another issue we discussed. We also discussed the aspect of assisting in risk assessment. We also discussed the issue of remedies. I think that is what the last minute of the discussion, we spend much time on remedies and how we can share how, as local experts, we can build sharing points with regards remedies. I think Marco emphasized that as much as remedies are talked about, there hasn't been much discussion and examples about them. Yeah, I think that's about all.
Okay, thank you so much. I think Helga had something to add also from your group.
Oh yeah, Helga, yes, can add.
Hi, so I'm from DYA team. Helga is in another screen. I'm Florencia, and I'm with another teammate that is Berenice. And we were talking mainly about remedy. On the first hand, about the possibility to create a bank of good practices, to share knowledge on how in other parts of the world, different companies address on the effects of what they do, or what they produce. So it was important to build this and to share the knowledge that has been created in the last years at least. And then we were talking about, so one of the main issues is the shared responsibility. So in order to share responsibility, I mean between companies and the governments, it's important to share spaces about these issues. So first, we recommend a type of workshop between the unions and stakeholders in order to have a common agreement on remedy and which type of policies can be produced. And this will also be very beneficial to apply remedy itself, and not only to be a discourse, a good discourse about how to remedy the effects of the companies. So yes, we were discussing about that, and also other tools to strengthen the network of experts. Mulenga was talking about sharing through WhatsApp different information and perhaps workshops in the near future. I also was talking about perhaps to have a type of workshop where we together develop a remedy strategy or a due diligence strategy on a specific subject. So this will create not only a community, but also allow us to understand how in different countries due diligence is approached. So yes.
So just for me to really understand the difference between what you mean with the systemization of good practices of due diligence and your last point, because I think they're both very interesting. I think they're slightly different, but just to make sure I really understand, could you just elaborate a little bit more on the difference between those two ideas?
Yes. The other one is a type of workshop between stakeholders and unions in order to start thinking about remedy itself before thinking on a specific case on how to address the effects of the production or what the companies do. You know, perhaps to have a common knowledge. So yes, I think it's important, because sometimes we think that when we talk about an issue, we all understand the same, but not necessarily.
Yeah.
So yes, perhaps as a first step before thinking about sharing other actions, to share a common knowledge and agreement about that.
Point. Thanks. Thank you so much.
then I will present. We had a lot of participants from the labor union, and they really want to also to educate the companies on the rights of laborers. So there you see this dissemination of information, educator. There's also I'll put my video on. And there is also awareness raising on the workers themselves. One of the difficult points here is that, for instance, in Morocco, there's a lot of labor done, a lot of production done in labor-free zones, and the companies working there, well, stand a little bit beyond the law, also beyond the labor law of the country, but not beyond the international law. This whole human rights in business also applies to companies working in the labor-free zone. Think alone about what happened in Bangladesh with the clothing industry. Those were also a kind of labor-free zones there, but still they have to respect. Another point was that we want to stimulate dialogue between the different stakeholders, and to also to advocate towards both the governments and also the companies to apply or to implement the ILO conventions.
So we had, as Dineke mentioned, she covered a little bit more the part from the trade unions. We also have representation from the CSOs. So I see also more colleagues from DYA Argentina talking a little bit more on the role of remediation. Also how CSOs can be already involved in actions, initiatives that can support already right holders, as we know are workers or community people or farmers, depending who we're working with, specifically of course, in the work they do with the blueberry, right? So how to connect this remediation that companies need to do as a step 6 of the due diligence with already existing social protection services, perhaps. So this is, I think, a very important aspect that we, as local experts, can provide to companies, right? And another point that was highlighted as well is how we, as local experts, can bring attention, perhaps also as the role of educator or raising awareness, and as well advocators towards not only national level stakeholders but regional level stakeholders. So some of our colleagues were reflecting on can be multi-stakeholder initiatives at the regional levels, can be also multi-state organizations, right, depending on the regions we are located, that they can also play an important role in the compliance of these regulations. So I think that there is also another level perhaps in the chains that might be of institutions or bodies that might not be completely related or within the supply chain, but can play a role into complying legislation and at the legal part. So yeah, I think those are other 2 points. If please someone from the group want to add something, perhaps we miss something, or you want to add, explain a little bit further from your experiences, you're welcome to do so. Yeah, I see them. No one wants to. I think perhaps we cover slightly. So yeah, that
thank
would
you.
be it.
Thank you so much. I think looking at the whiteboard, I think you had very nice discussions amongst each others. So what I tried is I am now trying to let you see another whiteboard. I know this is really hard to see, but we'll send it to you by PDF afterwards. Let me zoom in a little bit. So what I've tried is based on what you've discussed in the breakout groups and what was discussed this morning in our first webinar. I've tried to kind of group the different roles together. So the different roles you all see for each other are you are trainers, right? You can train. You can also provide technical support. You can evaluate. You can lobby or advocate, if that fits your organization. And I was looking for the right word, I'm still looking for it, but you're also an enabler or a connector. For example, between workers or local communities and these European companies, or national or local government and these European countries, or well, vice versa. There are lots of connections you can make. And then those different roles I can see in what you've mentioned in 4 different areas. So first of all, there's a very practical support of companies in doing due diligence, in these 6 steps of due diligence. And this really goes from identification of different risks, of developing good practices, providing insights in the local context. Well, you can read all of it, I won't repeat everything. Monitoring, of course, and also in remedy. There's a real chance in remedy and a real vital role you can play in remedy as well. So this is really about practical assistance, maybe technical assistance of companies. And also train companies in local context, local circumstances, and evaluate their due diligence system. Then there is also the bit of general awareness raising. So this is, maybe some of the post-its can also fit others, but I thought it's still a separate role. I really like the idea of systemizing due diligence practices worldwide. I think this is really something that's needed, because we don't want to invent the wheel every time again, right? So this is, I think, a very useful suggestion. I hope it will be picked up. But also to translate the requirements into language that's understood locally as well. And I think that's also a key role you could play. Of course, disseminate information on legislation coming up. And I also really like this coordination among stakeholders. I've heard it several times, but I think this is also quite a crucial role that you can play. Then, if it fits your organization, you can also lobby or advocate with local governments, but also with business associations. Tell them the importance of implementing the OSC guidelines if they want to keep in business, actually, with European companies. There were also suggestions of changing local legislation to be more aligned with international normative framework. And I think what fits here is also advocate for the ILO core conventions to be ratified and applicated. And also, I think the last suggestion that Angela made on connecting with the regional and local stakeholders, I think is also very interesting. And then finally, there's a role you've indicated for yourself that you can play within civil society, within trade unions. And here you can also train. You can train your fellow civil society people, you can train local communities, you can train workers, but you can also train different layers within the trade union, like all the way down to the representatives at a plantation level. So I think this is a crucial role, but also support organizing workers, identify firms concerned or identify rights being violated, also play a part in providing practical solutions to the problems found. For example, what was mentioned was change the mode of transportation of workers. And then again, working towards remedy also by facilitating this dialogue between different stakeholders and the unions. I think this is also quite vital. So I think this is...
Can I add something?
Yeah, please do, Dineke.
Maybe it's also good to identify those companies who are willing to observe the human rights due diligence law. So that there are all kind of examples in the different countries and regions. And you can also show others, well, they have done already part of it. If you say you don't know how to do it as a company, look at them, kind of champions.
Yeah, champions, that's a nice word, actually. Thank you for that addition. Okay, so thank you all for your insights and for your ideas. And then I give the floor to Dineke to tell you what's next.
Yeah. What is next? What are you going to do after this webinar? We have 2 more events for you in which you are hardly invited to join. The first one is on the 21st of June. We will have a series of webinars, the same like we did now, a morning session and an afternoon session, on access to remedy, including also grievance mechanisms. We will send you more information as soon as we have it, but this is just an invitation already to all of you. And then on the 6th of July, we will have an online end event. This is also the conclusion of the Food Covenant in the Netherlands. And in this That's a session which starts on 12 set, and it will take one set, and it will take 1.5 hours. And we want to bring together you as local experts and companies, because also in the companies in the Netherlands, we did all kinds of sessions for companies, and we would like to get to know one another, to invite you to get to know one another. Most probably the topics will be grievance mechanisms, trainings, all kinds of things. You can ask questions over to and fro. So these are the two things that we will still organize within the Dutch Food Covenant.
Thanks for joining. I hope it was useful for you. Don't hesitate if you have any questions to email one of us. I think you have a lot of email addresses, and we'll try to come back to you and answer your question. Keep up the good work, and we hope to see you again on June 21st for the Access to Remedy webinar. Have a good day.